our protocol. And so with that, my name is Laura Griffin. I'm the Family and Consumer Science Agent here in Pueblo County. And today we will be talking about pickling vegetables. All right, so to get started, we're just going to talk about some different types of pickled products. So first we have our fresh pack or quick process pickled vegetables for the most part. These are going to be pretty easy to prepare, and they are preserved using acetic acid, otherwise known as vinegar. And so that's going to work as a preservative by lowering our pH to below that 4.6. And if you remember from previous classes, that 4.6 number is really important for water bath canned products to ensure that we don't have any risk of botulism poisoning. So that Clostridium botulinum bacteria can't survive in environments below that 4.6, so an acidic environment. And so in the case of most of our pickled products, we're going to be using that vinegar to achieve that goal. And because this is a really important part of making sure that we're producing a safe product, we never want to use a homemade vinegar for making pickled, because we just are not 100% sure what the acidity of that homemade vinegar is. And it can vary dramatically, batch to batch or even jar to jar. So if you do make your own homemade vinegar, we would ask that you not use that in any sort of canning products. So we always want to use a commercially store-bought vinegar product. We also never want to decrease the amount of vinegar called for in the recipe. So again, because this is our main source of preservation and getting to that pH of below 4.6, we never want to decrease the amount of vinegar in that tested recipe that we're using. We'll talk about some flexibility with the other ingredients in a little bit, but as far as the vinegar goes, we really want to be strict and follow the recipe with that. All right, some other types of pickled products. So we have relishes and salsas. So some of our relishes and salsas are considered a pickled product, and they're most commonly going to look like some of our fruit spreads from our jams and jellies classes. So they're going to be made from chopped or mashed up fruits and vegetables. And instead of being mixed and cooked with pectin and sugar, they're going to be mixed with different seasonings, spices, and then cooked in a vinegar solution. So the process for a lot of these types of products are going to look a lot more similar to some of those jams, jellies, compotes, fruit spreads, things like that. But because of the vinegar solution, they would be considered a pickled product. Another type of pickled product is going to be pickled fruits. So like I said, the majority of pickled products are going to come from vegetables, but there are certainly recipes available for pickled fruits as well. So those will come in the form of some whole fruits, some sliced up fruits. There's even recipes for pickled watermelon rinds. So you use the rinds of the watermelon. But there's recipes out there for pickled apples, pickled pears, a variety of things that you can find out there if you're interested in getting creative with your pickled products. Again, just like with our pickled vegetables, these are going to be simmered in a spicy sweet sour syrup. And for our acid source, some of them are going to use lemon juice, and some of them will still use that vinegar like our pickled vegetables. All right, so fermented pickles is kind of a different style of pickle. This is going to be produced using a fermentation process rather than a water bath canning process. So we're not using the vinegar as our preservation process, but rather we're going to be using lactic acid. And lactic acid is actually produced by bacteria that is naturally present on a lot of our vegetables. So cucumbers and cabbage are two examples of that. We find this bacteria naturally on them, and by adding salt to these different vegetables, that naturally draws out and produces that lactic acid. And so that lactic acid is what's going to give us our acidity source. And that's going to help to lower the product pH to below, again, that 4.6 number to ensure that we don't have any risk of that botulism poisoning. So with the fermented pickles, it's a longer process. So we call the quick pack pickles quick pack for a reason, much quicker process. The fermented pickles are going to take up to 2 to 6 weeks to fully ferment. So just be aware that this is a little bit more of a time commitment. And then once they are fully fermented, you have a couple options. So they can be processed in a water bath canner for longer term shelf stable storage. So if you want to be able to store them at room temperature for up to that year amount of time, you can go ahead and process them in a water bath canner. Or you can go ahead and just put them directly in the refrigerator and they'll be good for about 4 to 6 months. So the pros to that are that it's a lot quicker just to throw them in the refrigerator. You don't have to go through that water bath process. They're not going to be good quite as long, but 4 to 6 months is still a decent amount of time. The biggest thing to note with this process is a lot of people like the fermented food products for the gut health, the good natural bacteria that is formed, the probiotics that are formed in fermented foods. So if that's something that attracts you to the fermented pickles or other fermented foods, if you water bath can those products, it will actually destroy those good bacteria and probiotics. So it'll stay good longer. You can store it at room temperature, but you do lose those kind of beneficial probiotics, unfortunately. All right, so another style of pickle is the refrigerator pickle. So similar to the freezer jam that we talked about in the fruit spreads class, these pickles are not going to be processed in a boiling water bath canner. And so they're just stored directly into our refrigerator. So in order to prevent foodborne illness causing bacteria, the refrigerator pickles still must have a pH of that 4.6 or below. So again, very important that we have enough vinegar content to get to that acidity mark. And there are a couple different options for recipes when it comes to refrigerator pickles. So there are specific recipes out there for refrigerator pickles. You can also use any tested recipe for pickles as long as the recipe contains as much vinegar or more as it does other liquids. So if you find a recipe that you really like, as long as it has at least an equal amount of vinegar to the other liquids in the recipe, it can be used as a refrigerator pickle recipe and doesn't have to be processed in a water bath canner as long as you're storing it in the refrigerator immediately. All right, and then a couple other types of pickled vegetables. We have low salt pickles. So like I mentioned, the vinegar is what's really doing the heavy lifting of the preservation in pickled products, not so much the salt. So the salt actually can be reduced or removed, but it's likely going to affect the quality. So the salt's not necessarily acting as a preservative, but it's certainly contributing to the flavor and in some cases the overall quality and texture of the pickles. So there are tested recipes out there for low salt pickles. If that's something that you want to explore, I would certainly recommend using a specific low salt pickle recipe because that's going to give you the best possible quality product without using quite as much salt or any salt at all. Similarly, no sugar added pickles. So some of our sweet pickle recipes are going to call for sugar. Again, that's not going to be our main source of preservation, but it is certainly going to affect the taste and texture and overall quality. There are recipes available using artificial sweeteners or no sugar added. Specifically, Splenda has several recipes out there that you might want to check out. But again, it is likely going to affect the overall quality. Pickles made with those alternative sweeteners are oftentimes a little bit more mushy and might not have the same desirable flavor. So definitely an option from a food safety standpoint, but the quality is likely to be compromised somewhat. All right, so just some notes about preservation by pickling. So if you are going to be storing your pickles at room temperature and want them to be shelf stable, then they must be processed in a water bath canner to prevent any sort of spoilage from bacteria, yeast, or mold. Again, there are a couple options with those fermented pickles or the refrigerator pickles if you want to go ahead and just store them directly in the refrigerator rather than going through the water bath canning process. Another thing to note is that microorganisms they're always going to be found on vegetables naturally. So water bath canning is going to help to prevent the growth of those foodborne illness causing bacteria. And the acidity of the brine, again, must not be altered because some of those microorganisms are actually heat resistant. And so they're not killed through that water bath canning process. And so they actually need that acidic environment in order to not multiply and cause issues. So we need that combination of the water bath canning and the proper acidity to ensure that we have a safe shelf stable product. All right, so again, I'm sure you've all seen this slide in our other presentations, but we have 4 basic successful steps to successful canning of pickles or really any food product. So the first is always going to be to review a tested recipe and instructions. The second is going to be to plan uninterrupted time for canning. The next is going to be selecting our fresh ingredients and then assembling our equipment for preparation and water bath canning. And so I know we've gone through this before, but again, a tested recipe just means that it's a recipe that has undergone extensive research and trials at either a university research lab or other certified food lab to ensure that these recipes have the proper ratio of ingredients, that the processing time is correct, that the pH is going to be a safe level, and that they have been altitude adjusted, all of that good stuff to ensure that we're not only getting a safe product, but also a good quality product. That's the consistency is going to be right, the texture is going to be right, and it's going to taste good as well. So they take all of those things into consideration. These are just a few places you can find those tested recipes. So here at CSU Extension, we produce tested recipes. We have a bunch of them available on our website. We also have an app, so it's called the Preserve Smart app, and it is available on your smartphone, tablet, or just on a website if you'd like to look it up on your computer. The National Center for Home Food Preservation is also a great resource for a lot of tested recipes, as well as just other basic information on all things food preservation. They are a product of the University of Georgia Extension. And then some recipe books available include the So Easy to Preserve book, the Ball Blue book, the Complete Book of Home Preserving, and the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning. So we always want to start with our tested recipe, make sure we review that, know what we need to purchase, know what supplies we need. A note about pickling specifically, some of the pickling processes are going to be a lot longer than other food preservation processes. So you want to make sure that you're looking at your recipe a few days in advance, because some of these recipes, you do have to soak your cucumbers or other vegetables in either a salt brine or a spice mix for somewhere between 3 to 4 hours for some of our bread and butter pickles, some of them up to 12 to 24 hours for some of our more traditional dill pickles. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Some of these you do need to start the day before that you actually plan on processing them. So making sure you have plenty of time, over a couple days is really key for pickling. All right, so selection of ingredients. We always want to make sure that our fruits and vegetables are going to be fresh, tender, crisp, free of any blemishes. They're not showing any signs of mold or mildew, anything like that. Ideally, if you can prepare them within 24 hours of harvesting, that's going to give us our very best quality product. Or try to store them in a cool, well-ventilated place until you are ready to start preparing them. For cucumbers specifically, that's probably our most popular pickled product. There are specific pickling varieties of cucumbers. So you always want to look for those if you're out at the grocery store or at the farm stands. Those are going to give you your best quality pickles as well. And when you get those cucumbers, you want to remove about 1/16 of an inch of the blossom end of each cucumber. That's where it's going to contain enzymes that may cause the pickles to soften. So you just want to take off just about 1/16 of an inch of that blossom end before you get started to help create a crisper pickle. All right. So for vinegar, you have quite a bit of flexibility with the type of vinegar that you want to use. Again, as long as it's not homemade and it has an acidity of at least 5%. So as long as you're purchasing it at a grocery store or a reliable retailer, all of those vinegars should be at least 5% acidity. And if you're wondering if they are, that should be listed on the label somewhere on the bottle. So you should be able to find the percentage of acidity somewhere on the bottle. Most commonly, we see pickles produced with either cider or white vinegar. Some of the pros to cider vinegar, it has a really good flavor and aroma, so it gives a nice flavor, but because of its color, it may darken lighter colored fruits and vegetables, and it will certainly change the color of your brine in your jar. So those are some things to be aware of. Probably most traditionally used is going to be our just white distilled vinegar. This is going to give us our clear, colorless liquid, and is probably going to be most recommended, again, if we have those light colored fruits or vegetables, such as onions or cauliflower, because some of those other colored vinegars are going to probably stain them different colors. You can use a wine or malt vinegar, again, as long as it's that 5% acidity, if you prefer the taste. But again, just be aware that it can cause coloring differences, not only in your fruits and vegetables, but also in that brine in the jar. And most typically, we're going to find in our recipes that there is at least as much vinegar as other liquids. So we're using quite a bit of vinegar in a lot of our pickled products. All right. So for sugar, again, you have pretty much complete flexibility on what type of sugar you would like to use. You can use the traditional white granulated sugar. You can use brown sugar, cane sugar, or beet sugar. Again, some of those will cause color differences and maybe some slight flavor differences, but overall, that's up to you. And again, if you're looking to use a sugar substitute, definitely find a specific recipe for those artificial sweeteners. And remember that the quality may come out a little bit different than if you're using a traditional sugar. With salt, we have to be a little bit more careful. So if your recipe calls for salt, you should be using what's called either a pickling or canning salt. You don't want to use a traditional table salt because that contains other products. So it contains iodine as well as anti-caking agents. This can cause a cloudiness to your brine or your liquid in your jar. And especially if you're doing a fermentation style pickle, those agents and other products can interfere with the fermentation process and it won't work properly. So there are either pickling or canning salts, depending on the package that you're buying, but it should say one of those two things, and they are available in the canning aisle. You can also use sea salt or flake salt, but you have to substitute it on a weight basis. So you'd have to measure out, how much traditional pickling or canning salt weighs, and then match that with your sea salt or flake salt. And again, this may affect the product quality. All right, so for spices, you can alter the spice content slightly to suit personal taste. So we don't want to be adding or subtracting so much of our spices that we're changing the overall, volume or density of our product. But if you want to add a little bit more dill, a little bit more garlic, a little less garlic, that's totally fine. So our most popular herb and flavor agent of pickles is going to be dill. So for the best possible quality, we want to pick our fresh dill as soon as the flowers begin to open and try to use it as immediately as possible. If we don't have fresh dill, you can use dill seed, although it's probably not going to provide quite the same flavor. So it might be a little bit more bland than if we were to use that fresh dill. And then some interesting things about garlic. So garlic's another one that we're going to see in a lot of our pickled recipes. And if garlic is uncured, so if you grow your own garlic or you find it at a farm stand, maybe it hasn't been cured, the pickling process will actually turn our garlic all kinds of rainbow colors. So it can turn green, it can turn blue, it can turn purple. As you can see in that photo there, we have some green garlic. So if you purchase your garlic from the grocery store, it's going to be cured, and you won't really have to worry about this. But like I said, if you grow it yourself, or maybe you buy it really fresh at a farm stand, then we would want to cure it for about 2 to 4 weeks before we use it, just to ensure that we're not getting all these crazy colors. It's not really dangerous, but it doesn't look the best. It can definitely freak people out when they see, green or blue or purple things in their pickles. And again, if you don't want to use fresh garlic, you can use minced garlic. And the ratio for that would be 1 teaspoon of minced garlic is going to equal about 2 medium cloves. All right, so there's a lot of information out there on different firming or crisping agents, different wives' tales even about how to really get a firm or crisp pickle. But research has shown pretty much across the industry that as long as you are using good quality fresh ingredients and an up-to-date tested recipe, and you're following that recipe pretty precisely, that the addition of a crisping agent is really not necessary. That being said, there are still plenty of them available out there, and a lot of our maybe older recipes or generational recipes are still including them. So just a little bit of information about some of the most common ones we see. So calcium is going to be what we would consider a crisping agent. It binds and cross-links the pectin in cucumber cell walls to kind of hold it together a little bit more firmly. It comes in a couple varieties. The first is going to be in the form of lime, which is actually calcium hydroxide. Lime can be a little bit scary to use. If you do use it, you want to make sure that you're using a food grade pickling lime only. And something to keep in mind with lime is that it will actually significantly raise the pH of your cucumbers. So if you're soaking them in lime, or you're putting that lime in the brine, you want to rinse those cucumbers really, really well before you process them, because they will start to raise that pH. If they keep a lot of that lime on them, you're going to create an unsafe product. Another type of calcium product used is calcium chloride. So this one, if you're going to use one, I'd probably recommend this just because it's not going to affect the pH of that pickle. It can be added to the jars right when they're filled, right before you put the lids on. Again, it shouldn't be a necessary step as long as you're using good ingredients and a tested recipe. But if you find that it works and you want to use a crisping agent, it's not going to hurt your food to add that calcium chloride. Some other ones that we commonly see, first up is alum. So this is going to come in the form of potassium aluminum phosphate or ammonium aluminum sulfate. We highly recommend against using alum because it has been found to have a potential correlation to Alzheimer's disease. So we don't want to be consuming this product for any reason. And then finally, we have grape leaves. So this is kind of my wives' tale one. A lot of people who have been pickling for generations, they swear by the grape leaves. They're not necessarily going to be dangerous. Grape leaves do contain tannins, so it can contribute to a bitter flavor, but it does possibly help to inhibit that softening enzyme found in the cucumber. So again, if you want to use grape leaves, that's fine. But if you're using those good quality ingredients, you're using a tested recipe, and you're trimming that 1/16 of an inch off the blossom ends where those softening enzymes are located, the grape leaves really shouldn't be a necessary part of this process. All right, so as far as water goes, we here in Pueblo County have pretty hard water naturally, and that can actually cause the brine to go cloudy. It might affect the flavor, and it might cause just overall discoloration of our pickled products. So when we're using water for pickling purposes, if you have a pretty soft natural water, you can use that. But if not, we'd really recommend using a distilled water just to avoid any of those potential issues. So you can purchase distilled water pretty inexpensively in jugs at the grocery store or at Walmart. If you don't want to do that, you can always distill it yourself at home. So all you're going to do is take your water, boil it hard for about 15 minutes, and then cover it and let it sit for 24 hours. So after that 24 hours, you'll come back, you'll remove any sort of scum or foaminess on the top, and then strain out any sediment that's settled on the bottom. And then you can go ahead and use that filtered water for your pickling process. And then finally, oils are generally not going to be recommended in pretty much any canning process unless it's specifically called for in a tested recipe, which, like I mentioned, is probably going to be pretty rare. But products with higher oil content are going to have an overall lower shelf life. All right, so before we start our canning process, we want to make sure that we have all of the proper equipment. And again, I know this slide is a little bit repetitive for some of you who have attended our other water bath canning basic classes, but we're going to need our water bath canner or a large pot with a lid and jar rack, making sure that that pot is large enough to be covered, to fill with water, high enough to cover our jars with 1 to 2 inches of water. We're going to need our jars and our lids. Again, those lids do have to be repurchased every time we have a new batch. We can reuse the jars and we can reuse the screw bands as long as they stay in good condition. And then some canning specific equipment. We're going to need a lid wand, which just helps, has a little magnetic dot on the bottom, helps to pick up our lids so we're not touching the bottom of them, contaminating them with anything. Our bubble freer. You can also use the back of a spoon or a knife or a plastic spatula, but essentially this is just going to help us to sort of agitate the outside of the jar, making sure that we're releasing as much air before we process our food as possible. The funnel, another thing that's just kind of handy to have to kind of contain that food product and that brine into our jar as well as possible. And then finally, we're just going to need some basic kitchen equipment, including a timer, possibly cutting board, knives, measuring cups, measuring spoons, things like that. All right, and then our steps to water bath canning our pickles. This is going to look very similar to how we water bath our fruits or jams and jellies as well. So to get started, we're going to fill our canner about halfway with hot water and start preheating that on the stove. And then depending on our recipe, we're either going to raw pack our food or hot pack our food. And so essentially the raw pack, the food is going to go raw directly into the jar. So we're not going to heat it up first. And then we're going to place a brine over it and proceed to processing. If we're doing a hot packed food, then we're heating it up first, possibly simmering it on the stove with different ingredients, and then we're going to place it into our jars and process. So that's just a place where you want to make sure that you're following your recipe and you're taking note of exactly how you should be packing that food into the jars. All right, so for hot packed foods, we do want our jars to be slightly heated up before we pack them, because we're going to be putting a very hot food into that jar. And if the jar is cold, that temperature difference can actually cause breakage of the glass jar. So we can either go ahead and put those jars in the canner as it's heating up, or we can run them through the dishwasher and keep that dishwasher door closed to kind of help that insulation and keep those jars a little bit warm until we're ready to start packing them. We're going to prepare our lids according to package directions. So I think I've talked about this before, but typically the directions are either going to say place in a pan, cover and heat, or they're going to say no preparation required. And for me personally, I always heat up the lids on the stove just a little bit. I personally find that it helps the seal rate for my jars when I do it. So I've had a few times that I haven't prepared them at all, and even though the package says that you don't have to, and I've had very low success with the seals. So I always just place them in a little saucepan and warm them up a little bit while I'm getting everything else prepared. All right, and then basically we're just going to prepare our foods according to the tested recipe. So again, this is going to vary pretty widely. We have a pickled green bean recipe available through the University of Georgia Extension. That's going to be a raw pack. So it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. You pack the green beans in raw, and then you're cooking a brine with vinegar and water and a few other ingredients on the stove that you place over the green beans. So it could be anything from that to making, a relish or a salsa where you're chopping up a bunch of different ingredients. You're adding that to the stove. You're cooking it with different spices, different flavorings, vinegar, other ingredients, and then packing that into your jars hot. So really, canning, if you learn nothing else from these classes, it's really all about just making sure that you have a good, reliable recipe and that you're following it explicitly. So definitely keep that in mind no matter what type of food that you're canning. But once you've prepared your food according to the directions, then you're going to get your jars ready. So if they are in your canner or dishwasher, you go ahead and remove those and start filling them, making sure to leave the proper amount of headspace. So headspace is just the amount of space between the top of the jar and where the food fills in the jar. So this is important during processing to make sure that we have enough space available that the food can expand properly without causing any breakage to our jar. So a good rule of thumb is that typically our fruit spreads are going to require about 1/4 inch of headspace. Most of our water bath can products, so our fruits, applesauce, pickled products are going to be 1/2 inch. And then our pressure can products, so our meats and vegetables, are going to be 1 inch of headspace. All right, so after our food is packed in the jar and we have the proper headspace, We're going to take that bubble freer like you see here in that top photo, and you're just going to run it along the outside of the jar, kind of agitating between the jar and the food. You should see air bubbles start to rise to the surface. And again, we're just trying to release any of that oxygen out of the jar before we process it. Sometimes when we do this bubble freeing step, it does change the headspace a little bit too. So if there's a lot of air trapped in there, it can cause our headspace to increase a little bit. So we might need to add a little bit more food before we put our lid on. So always double check and measure that headspace again after you've done the bubble freeing step. And then finally, we're just going to use a damp cloth or paper towel to really make sure that we clean off the rim and the rings of that jar. Make sure there's nothing on that rim that might get stuck and cause our jar to not seal properly. Then we're going to use our lid wand that we see there in that top photo to place our lid directly on the center of our jar. And then we will use one of our screw bands, and we're just going to place it on fingertip tight. So essentially, we just want to apply the screw band until we can adjust it very lightly with our fingertips. So it doesn't need to be cranked on there super tight. If anything, you want to err on the side of a little bit looser, because if you do put that lid on too tight, sometimes during processing, the lid itself can actually buckle over the screw band. And if that happens, there's no way to get it off. So you've just wasted your jar, your screw band, your lid, and all of the food inside of it. So again, always err on the side of a little bit looser. The screw band itself serves no function other than just to make sure that that lid stays in place until it can seal properly. So once our jars are filled, we've got our lid on, we've got our screw band on, then we're gonna go ahead and start loading our canner. So once our food and our lid is on our jar, we wanna try to disturb that jar as little as possible. So we don't wanna be sloshing it over, tilting it over, flipping it over, because some of that food or that brine can get under that lid. And again, that can affect our seal. So we want to take our jars pretty much straight up, straight over, and straight down into the canner, if possible. Once our canner is loaded, then we want to make sure that that water is covering our jars by at least 1 to 2 inches. So if it's not quite enough water, now's the time to add a little bit more. But if we're good, then we'll go ahead and place the lid on the canner, turn the stove all the way up, and wait to bring it to a full rolling boil. So we want to make sure that it is boiling pretty hard, that full rolling boil, before we start our processing time. So once we hit that full boil, then we'll go ahead and start our processing time. And again, remembering to adjust for altitude if you live at 1,000 feet or above. So altitude adjustment is very important in order to ensure that you're getting a safe product. So if you do live at sea level, you don't have to worry about this quite as much. But if you are above that 1,000 feet, then you will probably have some altitude adjustments for most of your recipes. So for us here in Colorado, in Pueblo County, we're at 4,600 feet, and we have altitude adjustments for every single canning recipe. If you're not sure of your exact altitude, you can use resources such as whatismyelevation.com or geoplaner.com. You can type in your address there. It'll give you your exact altitude at your kitchen, so you know exactly how to adjust for it. Some recipes will have like a table at the bottom. All of the ones through the University of Georgia extension have it right on each recipe. So it makes it really easy to remember, makes it really easy to see how you need to adjust for those recipes. If you're using some of those recipe books that we talked about, all of those recipes throughout the book are going to be set for sea level. And they'll have a table at either the front or the back of the book explaining how much processing time you need to add based on your altitude. So you want to make sure that you're aware of that and that you find that table and that you don't forget to add that processing time. All right, so once we have our processing time at that full rolling boil, we set our timer, the timer goes off, and then we are going to go ahead and turn off the heat, remove the lid, and then just wait about 5 minutes before we start removing any of the jars. The contents of the canner are very hot, the contents of the jars are very hot, so just giving it 5 to 10 minutes to kind of start to cool off is going to make it a lot safer to remove those jars. And then like we see on that bottom photo, we're going to use our jar lifter because again, these jars are going to be super, super hot. And we want to try to remove them again, just like we put them in the canner by disturbing them as little as possible. So we're going to bring them straight out of the canner, straight over, and then straight down onto either a towel, cooling rack, or cutting board. And so just like we needed to heat up our jars a little bit to avoid a huge temperature difference, same thing when we remove our jars. We want to put down some sort of just small barrier between our really hot jar and our potentially cool countertop. So I typically just use a dish towel, just put that down and put all of your jars right on top of that. All right, so once you've removed your jars from the canner, then you're just going to go ahead and leave them completely undisturbed for about 12 to 24 hours. So when you start removing them from the canner, sometimes right when you even open the canner, you'll start to hear some of the jars seal. You'll start to hear that kind of pinging noise, but some of them do take a while. So if you take them all out of the canner and, a few of them haven't sealed yet, don't give up hope because some of them truly do take, 12 or 16 hours to seal. And so we just got to give it time. Again, try to not disturb them and let them seal in their own time. If you remove them from the canner and they have water on the lid, sometimes it can be tempting to just wipe that off or tilt it and dump that water off. But again, just leave it undisturbed. That water will evaporate over time, and hopefully that lid will eventually seal. So we'll come back in that 12 to 24 hours and we'll check for our seals. So if it's sealed, that middle part of the lid should be indented. So you can kind of rub your finger over the top and feel for that indent, or you can look at it eye level and you can kind of see that indent in the middle. If there's still a rise in the middle of the jar, then it likely has not sealed. But with the jars that have sealed, we will go ahead and just remove our screw bands, and we can go ahead and store those. You can wash off the jars if there's any sticky residue or anything on the outside of the jar. We always want to make sure that we're labeling our jars with just the contents, so what it is, if it has any specific ingredients in it, and then the date. So you can either label it with the date that it was processed and know that it's good for about a year past that, or you can put an expiration date on it for a year past whenever you processed it. And then just like any canned goods, you want to store in a cool, dry, dark place. All right, so some processes not recommended for any type of water bath canning. First, we have open kettle canning. So the temperatures of this do not destroy the microorganisms that cause the spoilage and foodborne illness. There's all kinds of crazy recipes and ideas out there for canning in your oven, microwave, or even dishwasher. But again, these are not going to reach the appropriate temperatures and they're not going to prevent the risk of spoilage organisms. And then we have our glass and zinc caps and our Tatler lids are all going to be reusable forms of canning lids, but they're just overall really difficult to work with. They don't seal very well. Sometimes it's really difficult to tell if they're actually sealed. There's still ongoing research by the National Center for Home Food Preservation to determine even if the Tattler lids are safe at all. So, it's kind of an eco-friendly option because they are reusable, but the waste and the cost of getting more lids each year is very minimal. So I would recommend just using the traditional lids and making sure that you're getting those good seals and you're creating a safe product. And then finally, with electric power pressure cookers. So these have become really popular recently, and specifically, a lot of them say that they're safe for pressure canning. But based on the USDA definition of a pressure canner, they do not meet those requirements. None of their recipes have been altitude adjusted or tested for elevation. So we would not consider them safe, and we would not recommend using any pressure cookers as a pressure canner. So if for any reason some of your jars don't seal, if it's been less than 24 hours, you can reprocess those unsealed jars. So all you're going to do is basically remove the lid that didn't seal, discard it, place a new lid on top of that. Again, put your screw band on fingertip tight, and then reprocess in the water bath canner using that full processing time again. So that is totally an acceptable way to reprocess. However, sometimes the processing times can get pretty lengthy, especially if you live at elevation. So that probably will affect the quality. If we're boiling our pickles for 60 minutes the first time, and then we go ahead and add another 60 minutes to that on top of it, that can result in a mushier consistency, maybe not as crisp, and overall just a little bit less quality. So that's kind of up to you to decide. You can reprocess them, or you can just go ahead and put them in the refrigerator and eat those jars first. All right, so some signs of potential spoilage. In the case of botulism specifically, incorrectly processed foods or foods at the incorrect pH can actually be very dangerous, even if they appear normal. So again, that's why we really want to be strict, making sure that we have a good tested recipe and that we're following it very closely, especially with that vinegar or acid source content, that we're not adding or subtracting or changing that in any way. But the most common sign of spoilage for pickles is probably going to be our cloudy canning liquid or discolored liquid. And so this one can be tricky because it can be a sign of spoilage, but it also could be a sign, that we used the improper type of salt, or that we had hard water that we used. We forgot to use distilled water. So if you ever have any questions related to if your food is safe or if you use the proper ingredients, you can always give your local extension office a call, and we can kind of talk through what you did, what you used, and help to determine if that food is going to be safe or if maybe we want to discard it. Obviously, if we have any sort of strange odor or visible mold or mildew growth, those would be signs of spoilage and a reason to discard immediately. Also, if you go in your cabinet and you find that your jar is no longer sealed, that would be another reason to go ahead and discard. So like I said, there are a few pickling problems. The cloudy pickling liquid or discoloration are a couple big ones. Some other things that we find happen are hollow pickles or shriveling pickles, white sediment in the jars, or again, that blue or green or purple garlic. So if you do find that you make a batch of pickles and you come across any of these issues, you can always give me a call, or if you're not local to Pueblo County, you can give your local extension office a call, and we can kind of try to help work through maybe what went wrong and how to correct that in the future. All right, so that is my contact information, and with that, I think I saw a few things in the chat, so I will go ahead and check that out. And if you guys have any more questions in the meantime, please feel free to start putting those in the chat or just shouting them out. All right, so how to tell the blossom end from the stem end. So the blossom end is typically going to be a little bit protruded on the end. So it should have kind of a bump on the end where the stem end has kind of an indent where you pluck the stem from it. Ever use a combination of vinegars so that perhaps a bit of balsamic could be used? I have not personally ever used a combination of vinegars, but again, as long as they are all store-bought, commercially produced, and that 5% acidity, and you're getting to that end volume, that should be fine. It might create, you know, a interesting flavor. It might be good, might be bad. I don't know. Do the garlic colors bleed into the brine or pickles? No, it mostly just sticks with the garlic. But again, it can be kind of alarming to see green and purple garlic in your jars. What is the best way to clean the band so as to avoid rust forming on the inside grooves? Yeah, so I would recommend just quickly washing it with, you know, warm soapy water and then rinsing it off and drying it right away. So you don't want it to, you know, sit in that water or sit wet for long periods of time. And I wouldn't recommend running it through the dishwasher for the same reason. And really, the screw band shouldn't be particularly dirty. So it should just take a pretty quick little rinse of soap and water to get them clean. And it looks like you found a white balsamic pickling liquid online with a white distilled vinegar base. So again, yep, just make sure that that recipe comes from a safe source and not just, you know, somebody on the internet that made it up. If you guys ever have recipes that you have questions about, you can always send those to your extension office as well. We can take a look at those and see if they would qualify as a tested recipe. And that's all I'm seeing for questions. Do you guys have any other questions real quick? Otherwise, you can always feel free to call or email me if anything comes up. All right. Well, thank you guys for joining us today. And thank you to all of you who joined us for multiple classes in this series. Typically, this series would be in person. So hopefully some of you that are local might consider joining us again next year. Hopefully we'll be doing this in person and all of them will have an activity associated with them where we'll actually get in the kitchen and do some demonstration and some hands-on canning. So definitely look for that in the future. And thank you all so much.